Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson with this introduction to this week's podcast. This is going to be one of my favorite programs ever. I just had an hour with Tom Jones, the astronaut, the all-American boy, Tom Jones, who spent 58 days and 49 minutes in space on 4 shuttle missions, 3 space walks, has written a number of books, including Skywalking, an astronaut's memoir, which won the praise of the Wall Street Journal as one of the handful of greatest books on the space program. Ask the Astronaut, astonishing answers to questions, which I just read. Space Shuttle stories, firsthand astronaut accounts of all 135 missions, and so on. You can find him at all the usual sites, but if you can only find time for one of his books, Skywalking is the one that I recommend. He's an extraordinary man, straight up, all-American, no nonsense, forthcoming on every possible subject. We talked about his life as an astronaut and the world of the Lewis and Clark expedition. How do you propel your vessels? How do you choose your men? How do you report back? What kind of reentry issues do people have? The question that I wanted to ask was, at any point in your training, did they say, I know this is almost unthinkable, but if at some point you meet an alien, another life form out there, if there is a confrontation, as with Lewis and Clark in the Lakota, or a really tense and uncertain first meeting, as with Lewis and the Shoshone leader Kamiawait, were you at all trained even for an hour on this subject, or was this just regarded as an impossibility and therefore not worth a moment's attention? I'm fascinated by this. I was fascinated by so many of Tom's answers. I did not know, for example, that he and 2 colleagues took communion in space. I love that. Buzz Aldrin did when he landed on the moon in 1969, and that's one of the most fascinating moments in the entire history of the space program. But I did not know that Tom was a Catholic, and that he had taken the Eucharist with 2 others. What an extraordinary thing that is, a kind of a hyper-Newtonian moment in which you send a Volkswagen from a spinning planet, a spinning and traveling planet, a 250,000 miles away to another orb and land it within a few kilometers of your target, and sometimes right on the target. That's a profoundly secular, scientific, Newtonian mechanic, and then to contrast that with communion, which is it's an extraordinary spiritual event, and to think that there's irrationality in taking the communion because you are ingesting the being of God. It's mystical. It can't be understood. It can't be understood by Newtonian mechanics. That paradigm, that software can't read that relationship with God and Godhead. And so for the 2 of them to mingle in space is really, really extraordinary, I think, and I've been fascinated by it all of my life, and particularly since I read a biography of Buzz Aldrin and his communion. So what an interesting program this was. This is what we're doing at Listening to America. It's such an interesting time. The Jefferson Hour could do great things, and I miss it, and Jefferson is making some appearances, and there's always a Jeffersonian element in all of this, as there was in this program about Lewis and Clark and NASA. One of the things I'm going to do is set up another meeting with Tom in which we talk about America at 250 from space. So in other words, I'm going to say, put yourself back up on the space station, Astronaut Jones, and look down at American history from 1776 until today, and tell us what you see. And I think it will be a really interesting talk about 38,000 feet. How about 230 miles above the surface of the Earth? So I love this program. I think you're going to love it. If you have thoughts, let me know. Make suggestions about other topics we should take on, people that I should interview, books that I should read. I really need your help. As I look at America at 250, there's a lot of perplexity. I'm not finding the books that I really want to find that will help me make sense of all of this, and the scholars that I'm consulting often resist jumping to 38,000 feet. They want to stay within their area of focus, which makes perfect sense, of course. But I'm looking for these overarching analyses of America at 250. So, for example, if you know Yuval Harari, I'd love to interview him. How about Steven Pinker? Yes, you've got it. We're having these Zoom meetings now from every quarter at least, where I invite all of you just to come in and have an hour and a half on Zoom where we just talk about whatever we talk about. But this is really extraordinary, and this program really moved me because I am lucky enough to have a friend called Tom Jones, and lucky enough that he has time to spend with me talking about these great issues. So thank you, and please help. Give us ideas about things you would like us to investigate under the rubric, under the aegis of Listening to America. So become a friend, contribute if you can, but let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkins. And I'm delighted today to have my old friend Tom Jones back. Tom Jones, astronaut, born in 1955 in Baltimore, Maryland, has spent 53 days and 49 minutes on 4 Space Shuttle missions, has traveled 20 million plus miles in space. Lewis and Clark traveled 7,649 miles. So you've got me there. So, Tom, we've talked about this before. I want to go through a list of things that happened in an exploration mission like this and how they did it back then in Jefferson's time and how you do it now in our time. And you and I've had this opportunity in a lecture once in Portland, Oregon, and it was really extraordinary. I should tell everyone they can find you. You wrote Skywalking, an astronaut's memoir, which I think Wall Street Journal said was one of the top 5 books on spaceflight, which is an amazing achievement. Space Shuttle Stories, firsthand astronaut accounts from all 135 missions. And you co-wrote The Complete Idiot's Guide to NASA with Michael Benson and so on. So people can find out more about your work. I've been looking back into your background. We're born within a couple of weeks of each other back in 1955, before Sputnik. So you come at the other side of the space age, but you were just an infant when this all began to really rattle in American life. But also what really interested me, Tom, is that you flew the B-52. As you probably know, B-52s have been a big part of North Dakota's history. And I've been on one, but never up in one. And I know that what you really want is to be in space, what I really want, but I would give anything to make a flight on a B-52. They've been around for 80 years and they're still flying.
Yeah, first flight 1952, Clay. And so there are still about 70 of them that serve in the Air Force. And it's been a very adaptable design. It's a classic airplane, came right after World War II, first flew in 1952. And here it is, 70 years later plus, and they're still flying. And they've got this capacity to sort of change their clothes and change their capabilities with the times. And the Boeing engineers of the late 1940s built a very adaptable design that could be modified. You could stuff new things into it. And so it's still a very effective bomb truck. And now it carries precision weapons that can match any other platform that we carry, as long as the environment isn't too dangerous for B-52 crews. But it's still a very useful airplane.
So one of these days we'll finagle that, I should hope. So I'm going to put all these questions to you, be kind of rapid fire, but I want to start with recruiting. And I'll tell you how Lewis and Clark recruited, and then you tell me how NASA does it. So the expedition was authorized by the Congress of the United States in January of 1803. And if you can imagine it, Tom, they never wrote out a job description of any sort. They just wanted to round up some people who were willing to do this. And Lewis wrote a little bit about it. He said he wanted stout, unmarried young men with a pretty high capacity to suffer pain. So that was then, and they never had a skill set. They didn't say, we need a blacksmith, we need a carpenter, we need an illustrator. They just wanted men who could propel their boats up the Missouri River. How does NASA recruitment differ from that?
Well, there's some similarities in the sense that in the 1950s, when President Eisenhower directed that NASA hire its first astronauts, he said, choose them from the test pilot pool. And those people didn't necessarily have college degrees, but they were all serving military officers, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and then later on in the Army. And so these guys were, of course, very physically fit. They had to meet certain size restrictions for the size of the Mercury capsule. And they had to be able to endure pain, as you mentioned, because they were put through a huge battery of medical tests that really subjected them to all kinds of torture of the 1959 timeframe. Fortunately, by the time I was hired in 1990, the standards had been relaxed somewhat. Otherwise, I would never have gotten in. The need then was for people who could either be a test pilot. Still, that was part of the need for the space shuttle program. But then they were also looking for scientists and engineers. You needed people who could work in space in their disciplines of science or engineering, operate the machinery of the space shuttle, and be able to learn new things constantly and react to changing and difficult situations in space. I think that's the common thread. You've got to be able to learn, and you've got to be able to keep your cool under pressure. I think that's very much in common with Lewis and Clark. And very competitive too. There was not a public announcement in the Lewis and Clark days, but by the time NASA got into that selection process, they would put out a call for volunteers. When I was competing, there were 3,000 applicants and they hired 23. And this last selection in 2025, NASA got 8,000 applications and hired 10.
My goodness. So Lewis and Clark rounded up the kind of people that had the right stuff. But one of the people who'd been on the expedition later said, probably exaggerating, that there were 100 people who asked to be part of it for every one who was chosen. So highly competitive then too.
And certainly. And it sounds like they rounded up a team that could function together over years on the frontier in the unknown. And I think that's one of the things they look for at NASA today is people who can function as part of a group. You're not going solo. You have to be able to get along with everybody and not get on everybody else's nerves. And so you need these people who can have a sense of humor, assess the moods of their comrades, and of course, boost them when they're down. Everybody's going to have down periods. And so I think that's a common trait with the Lewis and Clark Corps.
Of course, you're in a little bit more confined space than Lewis and Clark. Once they got out into Montana, the men could peel off for an hour and shout into the wind or go cool their sensibilities. But when you're up there, that's a pretty small space, right?
It wasn't the shuttle, but again, a couple of minivans worth of volume is what we were allotted on the space shuttle. But it was only a couple of weeks in space. And so as a professional, you can put up with the psychological irritants or personalities that grate on you the wrong way. And I found a little bit of that, in the 20 people that I flew with. However, today, when you've got these long expeditions, 6 months up to a year now on the space station, the fortunate circumstance for those crew members is that they've got the interior space of about a 5-bedroom house. And so there are places where you can go to get away from everybody else, despite your being indoors in that harsh environment. And then every now and then, if you're lucky, you have the relief of going on a spacewalk where the expanse outside your helmet is limitless. And you do have a sense of being outside and away from the irritants back inside.
And I think you did 4 spacewalks?
3 spacewalks,
3.
Yes, to help build the space station.
Amazing. So I remember when I was in grade school watching the first American spacewalk. Was it 1964 or 5?
5.
And Ed White was out for just a short time.
20 minutes.
And I've been fascinated ever since. I can't imagine anything that would be more extraordinary than being tied by an umbilical to this fragile spaceship and out essentially orbiting the planet Earth yourself as a small projectile, as a small planet.
He was tethered by his umbilical. I was tethered to the Space Shuttle Earth Station by a steel safety tether. But there were people, my colleagues like Bruce McCandless, the first guy to become a human satellite. He was flying that jetpack, the manned maneuvering unit, and got out 100 meters away from the shuttle. And those spectacular photos from about 1984 show him as that famous first human satellite untethered. So that would be truly an amazing sense of escape. Although there was his partner, Bob Stewart, on that flight in 84, where he got away from the shuttle a few dozen yards and said, I'm going to turn my helmet and my spacesuit away from the Earth, the sun, the shuttle, and just see the expanse of the universe. And so he turned away and looked at the black expanse of the galaxy out there. And he said, that lasted for about 15 seconds. And then I said, I better turn around and see if it's all still there. So it does have, a couple of different effects on your mind. It's that exhilaration of being a free flying spacecraft, your own little commander of your little spaceship there, but also the worry that you don't want to be cut off from that sense of safety and familiarity that is your spacecraft.
Absolutely. So back to Lewis and Clark. So how did they train? So Lewis and Clark brought their men to a place called Camp Dubois or Camp Wood, and they spent the winter getting ready, and they had them build some huts, and they did shooting matches, and they went hunting, and and also self-defense skills in case they ran into trouble with Native Americans or the Spanish. And so they basically trained in marksmanship. How did you train?
Well, I think based on the Corps of Discovery and then later polar explorers, both the Arctic and Antarctic, we had some experience with what those extreme environments would require in terms of human qualities and training. So the space training has evolved to the point now where it is viewed as expeditionary training. So you're going on a long journey of exploration. That's the current state with the space station, and then eventually going to the moon and Mars. That requires people, again, to be team members that can support each other over long periods of time, to endure isolation and harsh living conditions in confined spaces. And so your training is designed to acquaint you with how to respond in an emergency. So marksmanship, not so much, but responding to sudden surprise, bad developments and being flexible enough to bring up various aspects of your experience and then marshaling those facets to cope with the new and unfamiliar situation.
I think what we're showing so far is Lewis and Clark just threw together a bunch of willing volunteers and did it. NASA, of course, is much, much more systematic and methodical and all that. But eventually you're on the launch pad, and propulsion is a huge difference between then and now. So Lewis and Clark propelled themselves to the source of the Missouri River on the backs and thighs of their men. It must have been unbelievably difficult labor, Tom. On a good day, they had tens of thousands of pounds of baggage in 3 boats going up the Missouri. On a good day, if they worked from dawn until late afternoon, they might make 12 to 15 miles. You didn't have to do any of your own propulsion.
No, you're traveling on rocket power. And when you get into orbit, a stable orbit has you going around the Earth at the space station's altitude about 5 miles every second. So there's 3 seconds and bam, there's your Corps of Discovery's progress for the day. Sometimes I could use that speed when I'm in a traffic jam down here on Earth. But you don't rely on muscle power, true. But there will be times when physical fitness is an essential part of the qualification of a space crew member in the future, because being a geologist on the surface of the moon, just like we did during Apollo, is going to rely on muscle power to a large degree. You'll have a lunar rover eventually where you can drive around, but field work requires you get out and work against the resistance of your stiff and inflated spacesuit. And even with 21st century spacesuit technology, it's still going to be a burden to move around and efficiently work like that. And it's going to tire you out. And you'll come in bushed at the end of every day, perhaps along the lines of those members of the Corps of Discovery after a hard day's work. There were demands on the Apollo astronauts, for example, where they actually recorded heart arrhythmias based on the load, the BTUs that they were putting out during their day's work on the lunar surface. So I think we'll approach that kind of exertion in the days of exploration to come.
I'm talking with the astronaut Tom Jones, my good friend. When we come back, I want to ask you about gravity. Stay tuned, everyone. This is a very special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Astronaut Tom Jones, we've got you trained, which is much, much more rigorous than for the members of the Lewis Clark expedition. The recruiting is much more sophisticated now than it was then. They were just looking for men who could hack it, men with the right stuff. And as you said, early on in the NASA era, that was more of an issue than it later became. Because later down there were specialists and people that were brought for scientific skills and other capacities that were not necessarily just people with the right stuff, although everybody had to be in good health to be able to sustain all of this. So I'm thinking about gravity. So for Lewis and Clark, the big gravity moment was the Bitterroot Mountains. I was just there again this summer for the 25th time. I climbed what we call the Wendover Death March. It's 7.5 miles straight up. It's a bear. Every year I do it and say, never again, never again. And of course I keep doing it. And the reason why that's so hard is that gravity takes over. So by this time they had 25,000 pounds of gear maybe, and all that had to go up and over peaks of about 7,400 feet. And so I always tell people on this trip, if you want to get a sense of it, just put a gallon of paint can in each of your hands and climb a bunch of stairs for a while, and you'll immediately realize what gravity does. It must be the most unbelievable moment when you finally get into orbit I remember reading in your book about answers to people's questions when you take off your glove and it kind of floats away. And it must be an incredible moment when you overcome gravity.
It's the proof that you've really arrived in space is when everything goes into free fall. You float off your seat pan and you're gently held by your straps. And first thing I did was pulled off my glove just to prove that I had actually made it after trying to get ready for space for 29 years and finally achieving that goal. That was really a dream come true and a magical moment to see myself in free fall. But then it becomes your challenge to use that quality of free fall, zero gravity, efficiently. The first thing that you do when you get out of your seat then is promptly bounce your head off the ceiling because all of your muscles are still working at 1G of exertion, and in free fall you'll just propel yourself right into the overhead. So I've had to wear a Band-Aid on my forehead because of that kind of
You
clumsiness.
bang around a little before you've learned that at the tiniest little push.
You do. You do need to learn that one fingertip is all you need to glide across the room, not your leg muscles to propel you over there. And so it takes a couple of days to calibrate your muscle exertion and coordination to be elegant up there. And I never achieved true elegance in space because my longest trip was only 18 days. The people who live on the space station for 6 months or more, they become so efficient that they are naturally adapted to this near lack of gravity. You've changed the level of gravity by a factor of 1,000,000, and your brain and spinal cord have adapted to that. And when you meet people who've lived in space up there on the space station for months, and you arrive as a clumsy person and you see them just gliding effortlessly down right on target every time, they never waste an extra watt of power in doing so. It's truly amazing how adaptable and skilled human spacefarers can be. So free fall is an asset, but then you of course lose things. When you let go of them, they drift off and you never find them again. Think of losing your powder flask and it vanished and you could never find it again because it got into some nook and cranny of your canoe. That could be a critical loss at certain times. So the same thing happens in the astronaut life up in space. You've got to manage all of your tools and equipment, not lose them. And then you've got to deal with the annoyances. Your food tends to float away. There's a problem with waste disposal and going into the personal hygiene issues with operating in free fall. So it's a challenge. And I think for my money, going to Mars someday, I think it would be best if the astronaut crews were given artificial gravity by either rotating the spacecraft somehow or spinning it on the end of a tether. That way you could eliminate all of the debilitating physical effects of free fall and not have to worry about those as you deal with all the other challenges of a Mars expedition.
Two things about zero gravity, Tom. One is that you begin to lose muscle mass up there because you're not using your body in the way that the Earth requires it to be used. And so I know there are bicycles that you strap yourself into, and there are rowing things and so on. And even at that, it's very hard for any astronaut to maintain full muscle mass over a long mission, especially if it's up to a year. And then secondly, of course, what goes up must come down. And these poor people that have been up there for a year suddenly are back on Earth, and there must be some incredible feeling of weightedness and sluggishness. And it must be really a weird first couple of days when they get back.
It's true. For my short trips, it was just an hour or so of feeling extra heavy and clumsy. But then the coordination required to move efficiently back on the ground takes about 3 days for an astronaut coming back from a short trip. So I couldn't drive a car for 3 or 4 days after I got back. I couldn't pick up a pencil off the floor without tumbling onto my face. So I tried not to do that. The astronauts coming back from space station require about 4 to 5 weeks of rehab with a coach, helping them with their gradual acclimation to one gravity again. And so, one astronaut told me when he got back from the space station, he said, the reclining chair was your friend. You spent a lot of time horizontal resting to try to do some brief activity in 1G, and then you had to rest again. You slept a lot for those first few days you were back on the ground. So think of the challenge of going across 7 or 9 months getting to Mars in free fall, getting somewhat debilitated, lack of coordination, and then you arrive in the Mars gravity field on the surface, 1/3 of a gravity, so it's not going to be as heavy as going back to Earth, but you're in 1/3 gravity, it feels probably like 3 Gs, and you have no coordination. So you're not going to be very capable physically when you arrive at your destination where the big payoff is waiting for you, but you can't do anything physically until you readapt.
I want to talk about language for a moment. So Lewis and Clark spoke English. They had some French watermen who could translate from English into French, and they met people along the way who could do some very basic translations into Shoshone or to Lakota. But they had some difficulty with this. As I understand it, and tell me if I'm wrong, that in space, English is the official language?
That's true. It's by agreement, the space station's official language is English. And it's true that all the crew members have to have some basic fluency in English. So our Japanese, Canadian, European counterparts, they have to all learn English. Most of them do marvelously in learning our own language. Because the Russians are a major partner in the space station, we agreed that everybody that would go to the space station would know both English and be technically fluent in Russian to be able to conduct business with the Russian control center and with your cosmonaut colleagues up there. So that's still true today. You've got to have some technical fluency in Russian, and you've got to study for years to get ready for that. However, you've got to cope with that whole international flavor of the space station. And thank goodness for my experience that I was only visiting the space station for a week, and my two Russian cosmonaut friends already spoke English fairly well. So I didn't have to learn Russian very much to get by on my last trip up there. But it's going to be true in the future that the international expeditions are going to have to adopt one standard, and then that's asking some contribution of time by everybody to learn their partner's language. It's just a nice thing for teamwork to be able to converse and have some small talk in your friend's language rather than just being in English.
Lewis and Clark relied on sign language, and I'm sure there's some universal sign language that you can use, like I'm hungry or move back, but you are depending upon verbal exchanges of language, and you learn some Russian, and other astronauts learn some of that, and foreign astronauts learn English, of course. But I can imagine that there are times when this creates some confusions and even some tensions.
Sure, if there's time pressure or you're in an emergency, you might want to revert to, of course, your old habits. And it depends on which part of the space station you're on, which language would be predominant. So if you're working in the couple, 3 or 4 modules of the Russian segment up there, and there was an emergency, then everybody would be expected to solve the problem in Russian. And so you've got to pass some pretty decent and challenging language exams for an American to learn that level of Russian fluency so you can talk to the Moscow Control Center, so you can talk to your cosmonauts under time pressure. And I think that that's been most ably illustrated by a couple of emergencies that occurred back on the Mir space station in the 1990s, where we had first a fire that occurred on that Russian space station, and the American on board had to work with his buddies in Russian to extinguish the fire and then clean up the smoke in the atmosphere that was contaminated. And then following that, a few months later, there was a collision on the space station where a cargo ship ran into the Mir and fractured its hull, and they had a depressurization emergency. So again, Mike Full, my astronaut colleague who was up there, had to work with his Russian colleagues in Russian to cope with that. Almost came to abandoning the space station in that emergency. And you can imagine that under that kind of pressure, you'd want to speak English because you're most comfortable with that, but you've got to think clearly in Russian with your colleagues to survive. And they both did that successfully, both Jerry Lininger and Mike Full.
As long as we're on that subject, the Russians are not exactly our best friends in the world. Those are the Canadians. The Chinese are not. Are there moments up there when you're made aware of the earthly geopolitics and there's tension or suspicion, or the Russians are talking amongst themselves, or the Americans are talking amongst themselves? Is there any sense of politics within the crew?
And there was in the 1990s because we were learning to work with the Russians for the first time. And that whole blending of two spaceflight establishments that had come from two different places and were very proud of their achievements on both sides had to mesh and come up with an operations plan for the space station. So I was in many meetings in Moscow where the Russians were obviously reluctant to give away some of their intellectual property and share it with the Americans and the international partners. And to the point where they'd said, almost in colloquial terms, they would say, hell no, I'm never going to give you that software because we developed it, we paid for it, and we're not going to just give it away. And we have a big obstacle to overcome by negotiation. And so it didn't express itself in my experience in space because my two cosmonaut colleagues up there at the space station, they were expecting us to bring up a brand new lab for them. They were very happy to see us. They had an American commander. They were already used to working with Americans. And so we got along quite well. But today, as you might expect, because of the tensions with the Russians down here on Earth, I think that astronauts from the Western countries involved probably just don't bring up political discussions and just try to avoid that topic. The Russians don't want to extend in themselves into political discussions because that might get reported back. And it's a very sensitive matter for you to criticize your government today in Russia. They would never want to be caught dead with having political discussions. So I think they just go around that and just talk about technical matters or how your family's doing. And personal friendship takes the central role. Trust is still there, but to avoid certain difficult.
So, to your knowledge, Tom, has there ever been a moment up there where there was like a clash where there's really serious trouble between factions or nations?
No, I don't think that's occurred at all. I think it's again this trust that you build up during your 2.5 years of training to get ready for the expedition. That's a relationship that you build on to get through those tough spots in space. And certainly, both sides are aware that there's different points of view. And I think the place to have those discussions is on the ground before you go up, rather than try to solve geopolitical problems in orbit. It's just going to make your life easier if you can dodge around those topics until you return. But the control centers today talk on a very plain and open basis and get problems solved. And I don't think they hold back on either side. And I don't think that's true of the crew members either. I think they can trust each other with their lives up there.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to something that John Kennedy really hoped for. He wanted international cooperation in space and proposed it a number of times to the Soviets and was turned down. This was at the height of the Cold War, of course, and he was heavily criticized in this country for even suggesting deep cooperation with the Soviets. But now I think that we've reached that point where I think you're sort of saying once you're up, there's kind of a king's X on all the crap that's going on Earth.
Right. Everybody's getting the news reports from the ground. You can read those on your laptops or your tablets. So that they're aware of those issues, but they just don't come to the fore in discussions just to make life easier. And they get by for 6 months and then they can go back. And the next time you have a rendezvous back home on Earth together as a crew, you might be able to sit over a beer or a shot of vodka and discuss some of that stuff.
Indeed. So Lewis and Clark had an advantage. They were a military operation, and when some of their men misbehaved, they had court martials and there were whippings and beatings, and one man had to run the gauntlet 4 times. I'm guessing nothing like that has ever occurred in space, but there have to be people that misbehave, who have nervous breakdowns, or at least go into a kind of a neurotic spell or stop working. Or how do you handle when somebody spins out of control? I know it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen.
It happens rarely, thanks to all the crew training and evaluations that go on during those 2.5 years of training. People have been removed from assigned crews because they can't get along or because they don't have the teamwork ethic that's required, and they can rearrange crew assignments to cope with that. But in space, there have been a few instances. I can think of one back in the 2000s when one Russian crewmate out of the 3 that were up there were one American, Russian commander, and a Russian colleague were all working together. And there was a cosmonaut who just decided after a few weeks of his 6-month stay that he was done, that he was through working hard and he was just going to enjoy the view out the window and survive until it was time to go home. And he announced that to his crewmates. He said, just don't bother me. I'm not going to do the work. It's up to you what happens next. So the Russian commander and Peggy Whitson, the American astronaut who was there at the time, looked at this, discussed it, and they said, well, we have 2 choices. We can either abort the mission and come home all together and say the mission's a failure, or we can just not tell mission control and conduct the mission with us covering for the workload of the 3rd member who wasn't cooperating. And that's what they decided to do. So they just stepped around his indolence and then wound up doing the work themselves. They got a successful expedition out of the way and came home. And of course, that cosmonaut was fired when he came back.
That's the end of his career as an astronaut, as a cosmonaut.
End of his career. I think he was at peace with that himself. He already knew that was the consequence that would come. And, we have 2 different cultures, obviously. So Russians tend to get bonuses when they do things well in space, extra pay, for example. And if they've made a mistake, they get penalized when they get back for those mistakes. In the US spaceflight culture, you're encouraged to fess up immediately if there's a mistake that you've made. There won't be any consequences if we can recover from it. And, there's no repercussions for admitting a fault because everybody's human and we do make mistakes. And that gets people, to get out of those situations as rapidly as possible and avoid consequences or implications from making a mistake and covering it up. So the U.S. spaceflight culture is no penalty as long as you talk to mission control about it or with your friends, and let's get on with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, how much credit do you give to the view that on one of the Skylab missions there was kind of a minor mutiny, and they said we're not going to do all this stuff, and NASA was really upset, and they wound up working it out, but it was a pushback, a pretty serious pushback.
Yeah, it was the third Skylab expedition, and the crew that had just arrived was immediately put to work on a schedule that the last crew had achieved at the end of several months of working efficiently. And so they were expected to step right in at that same pace. They could not do so. They were still adapting to space. And the miscommunication was that the ground didn't understand that they were still coming up the learning curve. And so because of some radio dropouts and some need to get some rest up there, the commander of this third expedition said, we're going to take the rest of today off. And, some historians or writers have said, oh, that was a mutiny. In fact, it was just the crew saying, we're going to just take the rest of the day off, you understand. And because of some radio coverage dropouts, the ground didn't realize that was what was going on for a couple of hours afterwards. So it was all overblown. And then the ground adjusted the work pace, and they all got along very productively and efficiently after that.
Of course. And so I remember reading a 3-part series in the New Yorker that really played up the mutiny. And but everything I've read since suggests, no, it was kind of honest pushback of an overwhelming work schedule. And NASA was willing to accommodate, not happy maybe, but willing to accommodate.
They were surprised on the ground that the crew was not achieving what the previous crew did, but that was actually a logical consequence of the situation they were in. And so it was just a lack of communication on both sides. And they soon rectified that and then revamped the work program. And by the end of that expedition, those folks were going full bore and surpassing what the previous crew did. And I've talked to the crew members who were involved, Carr, Gibson, and Pogue. So Ed Gibson is still around. I've talked to him about this, and that was just a misunderstanding.
Yeah, we need to take a break. I'm talking with Tom Jones, the NASA astronaut and the author of a number of books, a really extraordinary conversation about the Lewis and Clark expedition and the American space program. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this very special edition of Listening to America. Tom Jones, I so envy you. I so admire you for what you've done, and you've done something that most astronauts don't do, which is you've come back and you've written about your experience. And your memoir, Skywalking, is considered one of the best books on the American space program, so that's a great achievement. Lewis and Clark kept journals because they didn't have any telemetry and they didn't have any way to communicate back with Houston. In this case, it would be Monticello. And so they kept voluminous journals, 13 fat volumes of them. How does an astronaut record his or her activities in space?
That was a challenge for me because you don't want to forget the experiences that are overwhelming you for these weeks in space. And you don't want to forget any last detail because it's so enjoyable and so different and so fulfilling. So what I did to cope with the difficulties of writing in 0G, putting a pen on a pad is really difficult in terms of muscular coordination. What I did was I just took a voice tape recorder, the old mini cassettes. We were allowed to carry a personal recorder. And so every day I would just float into some corner of the spacecraft. And in the shuttle's airlock, for example, nestled among the spacesuits, I would pull out my recorder at the end of the day and just dump everything that I'd experienced or tried to remember into the tape recorder. And then, of course, I could add to that day by day, record some of the sounds that I was experiencing up there and some of the impressions. And then when I got back, I was able to look at that journal, convert it into a transcript, and that became some of the raw material for writing Skywalking later on, of course. But at least it allowed me to remember all those many details that I might have forgotten otherwise. And I thought my mission when I finished my astronaut career was to preserve some of these spaceflight memories because the taxpayers spent millions in resources to train me to get ready for those trips, and then millions to get me up there and do the work. And I thought they deserved some kind of feedback for the resources they poured into my experiences up there. And so I wanted to share those when I got back, both with my family immediately, but also to share that with the taxpayers and the public. I thought that was the second part of my mission. So that's what I did, is I just recorded comments and then added to them when I got back on the ground.
One of your books, published in 2023, Space Shuttle Stories, Firsthand Astronaut Accounts from All 135 Missions. That alone, 135 missions, really rocked me. If someone had asked me, I would have said probably 25 or 30 missions, but that's a lot of them. How many different shuttles were you on? 3?
I flew on 3 different shuttles, Endeavour, Columbia, and Atlantis, and that encompassed 4 missions.
And Challenger and Columbia, of course, both were destroyed in space. You flew on Columbia in an earlier flight. Now the sort of the conventional wisdom is that the shuttle was not the best possible vehicle, that there were sort of inherent designs, that its complexity was too great, and so on. I'd like to know how you feel about that. But were you ever really worried about the capacity of your ship to get you up and get you back?
Well, you're right about the fact that the shuttle was perceived sometimes as being not the right vehicle for the mission, but it was the best possible spaceship that we could build in the 1970s. And so it fulfilled the national mission set out for it, which was to be reusable and to provide a workspace that would provide us the ability to practice for space station missions in the years ahead, and to serve as a platform for all kinds of scientific and engineering investigations up there. So it really did those jobs pretty well. It just didn't do them cheaply, nor did it do them in a completely safe way. It wasn't as reliable as the engineers had set the goals for. So it was always an experimental spaceship. And I think many of us over the years of the 30 years of the shuttle's history forgot that it was an experimental vehicle and that we didn't know everything about the hazards of operating it in space. And that's why we lost 2 shuttles and 14 astronauts over the 30 years of the shuttle program. When I flew it, I viewed that machine that was keeping me alive up there and making me productive, I viewed it as an engineering miracle. That it was possible for human beings to develop a machine that could do this much in space floored me. I thought it was a fantastic demonstration of human ingenuity. And the fact that it did so many things well was really quite amazing from a technical point of view. Now, it was fragile. It had to cope with the harsh space environment. And in a couple of little design ways, it was not able to do that reliably 100% of the time. And I think the fact that it retired after 30 years was appropriate, because had we operated it for another decade, I think we might have lost another shuttle and another crew, just because of the design deficiencies of this 1970s spaceship operating into the 21st century. And what we operate now with the space station and the commercial transports that get us back and forth is a factor of 10 or 100 more safe than the shuttle could ever be.
I just want to get this straight. So you're on the space shuttle after the Challenger disaster, and at no point do you think, yeah, that one crashed, I wonder if we're even going to make it?
My approach to it was that Challenger had taught us so many harsh and painful lessons that we'd addressed all of those deficiencies that accident illustrated. So I was very confident that the ship was better than it used to be while I was operating on it. Now, I didn't know what the remaining flaws were, and we found out with Columbia what one of them was. And I probably should have been more worried in my approach to the job. But I thought that if everyone on the ground had done their best to get the ships ready to fly, that it would leave Earth in as perfect a condition as possible in terms of accomplishing the mission and keeping me alive and returning me home. So I just put that responsibility on those folks on the ground, the engineers, the designers, the technicians. And then what I was worried about, Clay, was whether I was going to live up to that standard in the work that I turned in every day. That's what for me.
You say that in your book, Ask the Astronaut. It's a humble and beautiful book, by the way. I remember in Apollo 8, which is my favorite of all the Apollo missions, because it was so breathtakingly bold, in December of 1968. But Susan Borman went to NASA and said, level with me, no BS. What are my chances of ever seeing my husband again? And they said, about 50%. And she was actually relieved that they were honest. Did your family, parents, spouse, did your family think, yeah, you really want to do this, Tom? I mean, you really want to go up in that thing? Because they do sometimes break up in space.
I never got that kind of question from my family or friends. I think that they realized how long I'd been in pursuit of this goal and how exhilarated I'd be to achieve it. So they didn't want to pop that bubble. But I know they were worried. Certainly, my mother, who had never flown on an airplane and never did, was
Wow.
sending her son into space, and she must have been boggled at the idea, but she supported me. And my
Oh,
wife
wow.
was very much concerned and worried. And when we lost Columbia to a reentry accident in 2003, she pointed out to me that she said, I was worried about that every time that you went up and you were oblivious. And she's right. I did not assess the risks of reentry to the degree that she did, and she assessed them more correctly than I did.
Just one last question about Columbia. So an insulation panel is damaged in takeoff. That means that the plasma is able to get in and destroy the wing structure. Would it have been at all possible for them to do an extra vehicle mission to try to fix it?
Well, two questions. Could you have fixed it with the resources on board? And the answer is no.
Right.
They didn't have any equipment
Okay.
on board to patch a hole or a crack in one of those carbon panels on the wing leading edge. Nor did they know that they had the damage. The crew didn't have the tools aboard to see that area of the wing, and mission control and the managers on the ground, for a variety of reasons, did not seek the imagery that might have given them more information. So they couldn't fix it in orbit. Now, if you had decided on day 2 of the 16-day mission that the ship was irreparably damaged and could not come home, you might at that point have been able to string together a rescue shuttle to be launched and bring the crew over in spacesuits and return them home. But everything would have had to break the right way for that to succeed. And you'd be subjecting that second rescue crew to the same risks that you just saw that first crew experience. So it would have been a really tough call for a ground manager, a NASA manager, to say, we're going to give up on this mission, declare the ship dead, and then launch a rescue mission. It would have been every bit as a roll of the dice as Apollo 8 was, or as gutsy as the rescue of Apollo 13.
Yeah, I see that. And the Soyuz couldn't have gone up with a giant epoxy gun or something. I mean, that would be more likely that the Russians could have gone up with a rescue mission, but of course they didn't really know how severe the issue was.
They didn't have that info. The Soyuz seats 3. There were 7 astronauts in space. So
Before
fixing the shuttle, yeah, fixing the shuttle with any kind of spacewalk from either country would have been unknown territory. And I think the rescue mission to just get them over to another spaceship would have been the way to go.
Now, so let me just change the subject slightly. So you do say in your book, Ask the Astronaut, that the question was, what do you do during the period when you're up there and it hasn't yet launched? And you said, well, a lot of it is reporting and back and forth with Houston and with ground control and so on. But you did say there's some idle time, and you said that you prayed, and I think you prayed for your own capacity to live up to the expectations of the world and of NASA and the United States. But I'm interested in religion in space, and as you know, I've given lectures on this and done an online course. I'd love to talk further with you about all that. We have talked about it a little in the past, but the most famous instance, of course, is Buzz Aldrin taking communion on the surface of the moon shortly after they landed in July of 1969. What do you know about religious activity in space?
It was tough to fit it into any flight plan all the way through the shuttle era because people are so busy up there. They're working 16 hours a day plus. So it's tough to have organized religious activities. I think my experience was rather typical on the space shuttle, where you might carry up prayers with you. Like on one mission, I carried a small Bible. Another mission, I carried, on all my missions, I carried the Sunday readings that I would have had used at Mass as a Catholic with me. And then I was able, with a couple of my colleagues on my first mission, we brought the Blessed Sacrament, the Holy Eucharist, into space with us. So we shared communion in space, as Buzz Aldrin did, and so we 3 Catholics had a communion service on board, and that was quite moving. One of the spiritual highlights of my experiences in space. To the degree that you have a little bit of free time at the end of a day, you might be able to do those readings or share communion. It certainly wasn't a daily activity. It was just too busy for that. Fortunately, on the space station, there's a lot more time. You get half a Saturday and all of Sunday off on the space station. So I think people tend to participate in their own way, more in their religious traditions. They have that time available up there. And today on the space station, you can call to the ground anytime you'd like and talk to anybody you'd like to. So you might call your chaplain and have an inspirational conversation that way. So it's not all on you. You can actually get some counseling or some spiritual advice. I think that's probably taken advantage of, although I haven't heard of those instances going on. So there are many people of faith who fly in space, and then they've written about it afterwards. There's some quite good books about the view of creation that you get in space and the photography that illustrates that. Jeff Williams comes to mind. The Work of His Hands, I think, is the title of his book.
I want to ask you about navigation. So Lewis and Clark painstakingly attempted to ascertain latitude and longitude. They were pretty good at latitude. They really were bad at longitude. And the data was never useful after they returned. That's partly Jefferson's fault, but that's another story. And they also were doing dead reckoning, and their dead reckoning was really good. I mean, Clark was able to produce a map by looking at the next bend or that tree in the distance or that bluff, and he was able, on some marvelous, almost intuitive sense, to be able to measure space by dead reckoning. As I understand it, at least in the Apollo missions, some of the astronauts had to know how to do celestial navigation by sextants and so on in space.
True. Great example, Jim Lovell, who just passed away in August, the Apollo 8 crew member and the commander of Apollo 13 and a two-time Gemini astronaut. He was the navigator on Apollo 8, and he had to test as a backup to mission control the onboard navigation capability of his Apollo spacecraft. So he had a sextant built into the navigational system and the flight computer, and he made sightings on stars and fed them into the computer, and it spat back out their position and what maneuver would be required to go around the moon and into orbit and so on. He did that quite successfully. So that was a design requirement of the Apollo spaceship. If they were cut off from Houston, they had to be able to navigate their way back. And he demonstrated that among others who flew on Apollo. And, it's gotten so much better now with the computer capability that we have on board that it's almost automatic. The spacecraft displays to you on your digital screens these days, what your state vector, your velocity and position is very clearly. And it can be updated from Houston or from Moscow. And you can also develop it yourself by doing star sightings with your sextant on board, just as they did during Apollo. So it's very reliable thanks to the accuracy of the inertial measurement units on board. It's still going to be a challenge to be precise enough to successfully reach Mars, for example, on a long expedition. So we are still on the frontier of some of that navigation challenge. And I marvel at how the whole problem of navigation has been approached and solved over the last few centuries. Lewis and Clark were great practitioners of it with the technology and the tools that they had. And, we've just continued to improve those tools and make them work for us in a marvelous way. I didn't really have to think about it, Clay, when I was up in space. It was just the spaceship always knew where it was, and it could tell me exactly what to do to get back to Florida.
In this era, is there one astronaut on every mission who could do it if they had to?
It's a team effort. Again, you on the space station, not a problem because you're just endlessly falling around the Earth. There's no landing required. But
Right.
to land on the moon, yes, it's going to be a combination of uplinked tracking data from Houston to your spacecraft so it knows exactly where it is. And then the computers on board will be executing the descent and checking its navigational landmarks as it heads down towards the surface. And you as the crew member, as a team, you're going to have to be cross-checking those references and validating what the computer is producing in terms of its targeting and where it's taking you, just like Neil Armstrong had to do. I think it's still going to be very much a human in the loop problem.
So I want you to come back and have another conversation about the current status of the space programs of the world and the commercialization of all of this and the debacle at Boeing and so on. But for the moment, let me ask you one last question, astronaut Tom Jones, and it's a reentry question, going back to Lewis and Clark. So Clark reenters quite successfully, gets married, has children, buys property, becomes an important figure in St. Louis, and 20,000 people march in his funeral procession. Lewis never marries, lives in rental property, can never really get it together, and winds up killing himself 3 years after his return. And I've written a book about this, about his reentry issues, and notoriously Buzz Aldrin had reentry issues. Did you have reentry issues of any sort, even for a few days, where it's just like you can't really deal with the suddenly this world that's intruding on you?
No, and I think that's because, astronauts are not treated as celebrities much anymore. You're not a face that people recognize on the street. So there was no big crash from the heights of celebrity down to normal existence again. So I was just one of the workers that was involved in these shuttle missions. So, we already knew how to keep a level strain when you got back. And so for me, it was always, hey, when can I go again? That was the next challenge that was always keeping me motivated. And when I flew my last mission, it was deliberate. I chose that as my last mission on STS-98 in 2001. And I knew what my plan was afterwards with my family. So there was a lot of anticipation of what that next chapter of my life would be like. I was looking forward to that. So I didn't have any reentry problems, but it's certainly true that the intense preparations and then the achievements of spaceflight could lead to a letdown. Any high-powered Type A group like that is going to have people who, just sort of wonder how to cope with that next phase of their lives.
That's really well said. So let's close with this. I was really saddened when Frank Borman died a couple of years ago now, and Jim Lovell died recently. So what do we have? Harrison Schmitt, Buzz Aldrin. Who's left? Who stepped foot on the moon?
There's four moonwalkers, right? Dave Scott, Buzz Aldrin, Jack Schmitt, and Charlie Duke. And those are the four moonwalkers. And there are a few others who orbited the moon and didn't land that are still left alive, but not too many of those either. I think the way to salvage that sense of loss is to have Americans and our partners back on the moon by the time we lose the last of those explorers and carrying on that mission.
What a great way to end this, and such a purposeful and hopeful end. Tom Jones, thank you. I feel so honored that you've given us this time. People are going to love this program. Do you have a website people can go to?
Sure. It's astronauttomjones.com.
That's easy enough. So I'll get on your schedule. We'll meet again here shortly. But for everybody else, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.